Hello. Welcome to Bedtime. History. The sea was calm enough to reflect the pale light of the northern sky. A small wooden ship drifted through the morning mist, its carved dragon head pointing toward a coastline that seemed to emerge from another world. On board stood a handful of men wrapped in thick wool cloaks, their hands rough from years of rowing and farming. They were not kings. They did not command great armies. They carried no banners announcing the birth of an empire. Yet the quiet choices made on mornings like this would echo across Europe for centuries. History often remembers the Vikings as fearless raiders arriving without warning, their longships appearing like shadows on the horizon before villages burst into panic. But that famous image is only part of the story. Before they became legends, they were farmers waiting for short summers, traders following rivers into unknown lands, fathers teaching sons how to shape timber, and mothers keeping households alive through winters that seemed to last forever. Their world was built not only on battle, but on endurance. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise of all. The Viking Age did not begin because a people suddenly became violent. It began because a harsh land demanded resilience, because opportunities lay beyond familiar shores, and because a generation of ambitious men and women looked across the sea and imagined that life might exist somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. Welcome back. If quiet journeys through history help you unwind at the end of the day, consider leaving a gentle like and subscribing for more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There is something strangely comforting about knowing that while one person listens beneath a midnight sky, another is beginning a peaceful morning on the other side of the world. Now, settle into your chair or your bed. Let your breathing become slower. Let the sounds around you fade into the background. Tonight, we are traveling more than 1,000 years into the past, to a land of icy fjords, towering forests, roaring seas, and people whose lives would reshape medieval Europe in ways that few could have imagined. Long before maps showed clear borders or nations carried familiar names, the northern reaches of Europe were home to scattered communities living along rugged coastlines. This was Scandinavia, a region stretching across what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It was beautiful, but beauty often came with hardship. The mountains rose sharply from the sea, leaving little flat land for farming. Winters arrived early and lingered stubbornly. Snow covered valleys for months, while icy winds swept across rocky shores. Even during summer, the growing season was short. Every harvest mattered. Every animal was valuable. Every mistake could mean hunger before spring returned. To those living farther south, these northern lands seemed distant and mysterious. Roman writers had described them only vaguely, imagining forests without end and cold beyond reason. For centuries, the people living there remained on the edge of Europe's written history. They were known mostly through rumor, travelers' tales, and scattered encounters. But while southern kingdoms looked north with uncertainty, life in Scandinavia followed its own quiet rhythm. Families gathered in timber longhouses whose thick walls shielded them from freezing winds. Fires burned day and night in the center of these homes, filling the air with the smell of smoke and pine. Above the flames hung iron pots filled with simple meals of barley, fish, and whatever meat had been carefully preserved through the cold months. Outside, children learned practical skills from an early age. They watched elders carve wood into tools, mend fishing nets, and repair boats. They understood that survival depended not on wealth but on cooperation. Every member of a household had responsibilities, and everyone contributed. These were not isolated individuals living alone in the wilderness. Communities were tightly connected through family ties, shared traditions, and mutual obligations. Honor carried enormous weight. A person's reputation could shape friendships, marriages, business agreements, and even peace between neighboring families. That mattered more than outsiders often realized. Centuries later, stories would describe Vikings as reckless warriors eager for battle. Yet violence was rarely the first choice within their own communities. Disputes could be settled through assemblies known as things, gatherings where free men met to discuss laws, settle conflicts, and make important decisions. These meetings remind us that Viking society was not simply chaotic. It possessed rules, customs, and systems that helped maintain order. Of course, justice was not always gentle. Honor demanded compensation for wrongs, and feuds could continue for generations if settlements failed. Still, the existence of these assemblies reveals a society attempting to balance strength with law. And beneath all of this, something larger was beginning to take shape. Scandinavia's geography shaped its people in remarkable ways. Rivers carved paths through forests. Narrow fjords reached deep into the mountains, creating natural harbors where boats could be safely anchored. The sea was not viewed as a barrier. It was a road. For children growing up beside these waters, rowing became as natural as walking. They learned to read changing winds, recognize shifting tides, and navigate coastlines long before many of them traveled beyond familiar villages. Boat building became one of the greatest achievements of the Norse world. Generation after generation improved their craft. Shipbuilders selected flexible oak and sturdy pine with extraordinary care. Each plank was shaped by hand and fastened together using techniques refined over centuries. The result was something unlike almost any vessel in Europe at the time. The famous longship was remarkably light, yet incredibly strong. Its shallow draft allowed it to sail across open seas before slipping into rivers too narrow for larger ships. It could be pulled onto beaches instead of requiring ports. It could carry warriors, merchants, explorers, livestock, and supplies over astonishing distances. Looking at one today in a museum, it is easy to admire its graceful shape. But for the people who built them, these ships represented possibility itself. A family could use one to fish. A trader could use one to seek new markets. An explorer could use one to search for distant lands. A warrior could use one to launch a surprise attack. The ship itself did not determine destiny. It simply opened doors. And that simple fact would quietly transform Europe. Yet technology alone never changes history. There must also be reasons for people to use it. To understand why the Viking Age truly began, we have to step back and look beyond Scandinavia itself. During the 8th century, Europe was changing. Old powers had weakened while new kingdoms struggled to establish control. Trade routes expanded. Wealth accumulated in monasteries, towns, and royal courts. Christianity spread steadily across much of the continent, bringing new centers of learning, beautiful churches, and monasteries filled with precious books, silver vessels, and finely crafted treasures. Many of these religious communities stood close to coastlines or rivers. They were built for prayer rather than defense. Thick stone walls were still uncommon, permanent armies were rare, and local rulers often lacked the resources to protect every settlement. From the perspective of those living in northern Scandinavia, these distant lands offered opportunities that scarcely existed at home. A successful trading voyage might return with exotic goods. An adventurous expedition might discover fertile farmland. A raid could bring silver that would take years to earn through ordinary labor. These possibilities spread through conversation around winter fires. Travelers returned with stories of prosperous towns beyond the sea. Merchants described distant markets where valuable furs, walrus ivory, amber, and slaves could be exchanged for silver coins, silk, glassware, and finely forged weapons. Not every tale was accurate. Some were exaggerated. Some grew more dramatic each time they were told. But stories have a remarkable power. Even when imperfect, they inspire action. Young men listened carefully. So did ambitious local leaders hoping to increase their influence. Success abroad meant prestige at home. Wealth attracted followers. Followers increased power. Power created opportunities for even larger expeditions. The decision to leave home rarely belonged to a single cause. Some sought riches. Some sought land. Some hoped to escape family disputes. Others simply wanted adventure in a world where few people ever traveled far from the place they were born. History has a habit of reducing these motives into one simple explanation. The reality was far more human. Imagine standing beside a cold Norwegian fjord around the year 790. Behind you lies a small farm your family has worked for generations. Ahead stretches an endless sea whose horizon disappears into mist. You have heard stories of distant islands where monasteries hold silver unlike anything your village has ever seen. You have heard of markets filled with foreign languages and strange goods. You know that staying home promises familiarity, but little change. Leaving promises uncertainty. But it also promises possibility. For many, that possibility proved irresistible. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable chapters in medieval history. Not because the Vikings simply appeared, but because the world they entered was far more connected, fragile, and surprising than anyone on either shore could yet understand. The first voyages that carried Norse sailors beyond familiar coastlines were probably far less dramatic than later generations imagined. There were no crowds cheering from the shore, no certainty that those who departed would ever return. A longship would simply slip away from a quiet harbor, its sail catching the northern wind while families watched until the vessel became little more than a dark shape against the gray horizon. For those left behind, waiting became part of life. Weeks might pass without news. Storms could swallow even the strongest ships. Thick fog could erase every landmark. Hidden rocks waited beneath restless waves. The sea offered opportunity, but it never offered guarantees. And yet, year after year, more ships returned. They came back carrying silver coins stamped with unfamiliar rulers, brightly colored glass beads from distant workshops, finely woven cloth, spices whose scents had never before drifted through Scandinavian homes, and stories that were often even more valuable than treasure itself. Around winter fires, travelers described monasteries filled with golden objects, bustling markets crowded with merchants from lands few listeners had ever heard of, rivers that stretched for hundreds of miles into rich kingdoms, and cities whose population seemed almost impossible to imagine. Some listeners doubted these tales. Others believed every word. Either way, curiosity continued to grow. But before long, curiosity mixed with something else. Ambition. The leaders of small Norse communities were constantly competing with one another. Wealth did not simply make a man comfortable. It strengthened his influence. A successful chieftain could reward loyal followers with gifts, host magnificent feasts, arrange powerful marriages, and attract skilled warriors eager to join his household. Generosity was a form of power. A leader who could distribute silver, fine weapons, and imported goods earned respect that no speech alone could create. Because of this, acquiring wealth became deeply connected to leadership itself. And this is where the story begins to change. Trade had already shown the Norse that prosperous communities existed beyond the sea. But trade was not always the fastest path to riches. In some places, the temptation to take rather than bargain proved difficult to resist. The people living along Europe's western coasts had little reason to expect attacks from the sea. Most dangers came over land, carried by rival kingdoms or neighboring lords. Coastal monasteries often stood peacefully beside cliffs and sheltered bays, places chosen for quiet reflection rather than military defense. The monks who lived there devoted their days to prayer, study, farming, and copying sacred manuscripts by hand. Their libraries preserved knowledge from earlier centuries. Their churches contained beautiful metalwork crafted as acts of devotion. To the monks, these objects represented faith. To an outsider unfamiliar with Christian traditions, they represented astonishing wealth. The difference in perspective mattered. It shaped everything that followed. One summer morning in the year 793, the quiet routine of the monastery at Lindisfarne, on the northeast coast of England, came to a sudden and terrifying end. The monks had likely begun their daily prayers before sunrise. The sound of waves rolled gently against the rocky shore. Seabirds circled above the island as they had done countless mornings before. Then unfamiliar ships appeared. Long, narrow vessels approached with surprising speed, their sails catching the wind as they crossed the water. The men who climbed onto the shore carried axes, swords, and spears. Their attack was swift. The monastery possessed little means of defense. The raid itself was brief, but its memory lasted for generations. Valuable objects were taken. Buildings were damaged. Some monks were killed, others captured. Those who survived struggled to understand what had happened. News traveled quickly through Christian Europe. Writers described the attack with shock and grief. One chronicler saw it as a sign of divine punishment. Another wrote of fierce northern men descending like wolves from the sea. Whether every detail in those accounts was entirely accurate remains uncertain. Medieval writers often shaped events through the lens of religious belief. Yet there is little doubt that the raid on Lindisfarne left a deep emotional scar. For many historians, it marks the symbolic beginning of the Viking Age. But symbols can sometimes hide complexity. The men who attacked Lindisfarne did not suddenly invent seaborne raiding in the year 793. Nor were they the only people in Europe capable of violence. Raiding had long been part of life in many regions. What made this event remarkable was the speed, the distance, and the psychological impact. Communities that had once believed the sea offered protection now realized that it could also deliver danger. That realization changed defensive strategies across Europe. Monasteries built stronger walls. Kings strengthened coastal watch systems. Settlements that had once faced inland slowly turned greater attention toward the sea. But the Norse themselves were changing as well. The success of early expeditions encouraged larger ones. A young man who had never before left his village might now dream of crossing the North Sea. Skilled sailors passed their knowledge to younger generations. Boat builders refined their techniques even further. Navigation improved through careful observation of stars, coastlines, birds, currents, and the color of the water itself. No magnetic compass guided these early voyages. Instead, experience became their greatest instrument. A captain remembered the shape of distant mountains. He recognized the smell carried by changing winds. He understood where seals gathered and where seabirds flew toward land before sunset. The ocean became a map written not on parchment, but in memory. This extraordinary knowledge allowed Norse sailors to travel farther with remarkable confidence. Soon their ships appeared not only in England, but also along the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and the Frankish kingdoms. Some expeditions returned after brief raids. Others remained longer. Temporary camps slowly developed into permanent settlements. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. The Vikings were never simply destroyers. Many were merchants. Archaeological discoveries reveal Scandinavian traders exchanging furs, amber, iron, walrus ivory, honey, and slaves for silver from the Islamic world, silk that had traveled along distant trade networks, elegant glassware from the Mediterranean, and finely crafted jewelry from Europe. In places such as Hedeby, Birka, and Kopang, bustling marketplaces connected northern Europe to an astonishing web of international commerce. Walking through one of these trading towns would have been a remarkable experience. Different languages filled the air. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron. Woodworkers carved intricate designs into furniture and ships. Merchants argued over prices while children played between crowded market stalls. The smell of smoked fish mixed with fresh timber, animal hides, beeswax, and wood smoke drifting from dozens of hearths. These were not isolated villages. They were vibrant centers of exchange where ideas traveled alongside goods. Religions met here. Cultures blended. Stories crossed borders as easily as merchants. For a while, it looked as though trade might become the defining feature of Norse expansion. But history rarely follows only one path. As wealth flowed into Scandinavia, competition among ambitious leaders became even more intense. Success inspired imitation. A prosperous expedition encouraged another. Neighboring chieftains watched rivals return with silver and prestige, unwilling to be left behind. Each successful voyage raised expectations. Each season demanded greater rewards. The pressure slowly increased. Ordinary families felt these changes too. Young men departed more often and stayed away longer. Some returned carrying riches beyond anything their parents had imagined. Others never came home at all. Women frequently managed farms, households, and property during these long absences. Evidence from law codes, graves, and archaeological discovery suggests that Norse women often possessed greater legal and economic responsibilities than many of their contemporaries elsewhere in Europe, though their lives remained shaped by the expectations of their society. Children grew up hearing stories of distant lands instead of merely neighboring valleys. The world itself seemed larger than it had only a generation earlier. And beneath these personal stories, political forces continued to gather. Across Europe, kings struggled to defend scattered coastlines. Local rulers argued among themselves. Civil wars weakened kingdoms that might otherwise have resisted foreign attacks more effectively. The Norse did not create these divisions. They recognized them. A divided enemy was easier to challenge than a united one. Small raids gradually evolved into larger campaigns involving dozens of ships and hundreds of experienced warriors. These expeditions required planning, cooperation, supplies, and capable leadership. The image of the Viking as a wild, uncontrollable fighter misses this important reality. Crossing the North Sea demanded discipline. Navigating unfamiliar rivers required skill. Maintaining loyalty among crews required trust. Without organization, these journeys would have ended in disaster. Instead, they became increasingly successful. Yet success carried its own dangers. As Norse influence expanded across Europe, they would encounter stronger kingdoms, more determined resistance, and opportunities far greater than simple coastal raids. Some would no longer come merely to take treasure. They would come to settle. To rule. And eventually, to build kingdoms of their own. What had begun with scattered voyages across uncertain seas was quietly becoming something much larger, something that neither the Norse nor the people who feared them could yet fully understand. The age of brief raids was slowly giving way to an era of conquest, diplomacy, exploration, and transformation, and the choices made in the coming decades would reshape the medieval world in ways that would endure long after the last dragon-headed ship disappeared beyond the northern horizon. The change came so gradually that many people living through it may not have noticed at first. A raid that lasted a single afternoon became a winter camp. A temporary camp became a fortified settlement. A settlement grew into a town where children were born, crops were planted, and markets opened beneath the same northern skies that had once witnessed only the arrival of foreign ships. The Viking Age was no longer defined simply by sudden attacks along distant coastlines. It was becoming an age of movement, adaptation, and settlement. The Norse were carrying more than weapons across the sea. They carried languages, beliefs, customs, and ambitions. Wherever they arrived, they left traces that would remain long after the sails of their longships had vanished from view. One of the first places to feel this transformation deeply was Ireland. When Norse ships initially appeared along the Irish coast, monasteries often became their targets. These isolated religious communities possessed valuable treasures and relatively little protection. But after years of seasonal expeditions, many Viking leaders recognized that Ireland offered opportunities far beyond plunder alone. The island contained excellent natural harbors and occupied an important position within the growing trade networks of the North Atlantic. Soon, fortified coastal settlements began to appear. Places like Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Limerick, and Cork all owed part of their early urban development to Norse foundations or influence. What began as military camps slowly evolved into thriving ports where Scandinavian merchants traded alongside Irish craftsmen, farmers, and travelers from distant lands. Walking through Dublin in the 10th century would have revealed a remarkably international town. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into swords, tools, and horseshoes. Shipwrights repaired vessels pulled onto wooden slips beside the river. Merchants displayed amber from the Baltic, silver from the Islamic world, wool from Britain, and finely worked jewelry crafted by local artisans whose designs blended Celtic and Norse traditions. Languages mixed together in crowded streets. Children grew up hearing more than one tongue. Marriages connected families that only a generation earlier had regarded each other as enemies. History often remembers conflict most vividly, yet daily life quietly built bridges that warfare alone never could. But not every encounter led toward cooperation. Across the narrow waters separating England from Scandinavia, events were moving toward a far greater confrontation. The kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England had long competed with one another. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, and several smaller realms frequently struggled for influence. Their rivalries weakened their ability to respond collectively when larger Viking forces began arriving during the middle of the 9th century. This time, the visitors did not intend to leave after collecting treasure. According to later chronicles, a massive coalition known as the Great Heathen Army landed in England in 865. Its exact size remains uncertain. Medieval writers often exaggerated numbers, and historians continue to debate how many warriors actually took part. What seems likely is that this was one of the largest and best organized Viking expeditions Europe had yet seen. These were experienced fighters. Many had spent years campaigning abroad. They understood local politics. They recognized opportunities. Rather than attacking blindly, they exploited divisions between rival English kingdoms. Northumbria fell into turmoil. East Anglia struggled to resist. Mercia came under enormous pressure. One by one, kingdoms that had existed for generations found themselves facing enemies unlike any they had encountered before. Yet history rarely grants victory without resistance. Far to the south, the kingdom of Wessex remained independent under a ruler whose name would become inseparable from this chapter of history. Alfred. History remembers him as Alfred the Great, but titles earned in later centuries can sometimes make remarkable people seem larger than life. In reality, Alfred was a man confronting problems for which there were no easy answers. He inherited a kingdom under immense strain. Viking armies possessed mobility that traditional defenses struggled to counter. Raiding forces could appear unexpectedly, strike quickly, and disappear before larger armies assembled. Several times, Alfred came dangerously close to losing everything. There were moments when defeat seemed almost certain. At one point, he was forced into hiding among the marshes of Somerset after suffering a devastating setback. Later legends tell stories of him allowing cakes to burn while distracted by larger concerns. Whether those tales happened exactly as remembered is difficult to know. What matters is what they reveal about how later generations viewed him, not as an untouchable hero, but as a ruler burdened by uncertainty and responsibility. Instead of relying solely on traditional warfare, Alfred began reshaping his kingdom. He strengthened fortified towns known as buzz. He reorganized military service so that part of the population remained available to defend the realm while others continued farming. He invested in ships, recognizing that control of waterways mattered just as much as control of roads. These decisions seemed practical rather than dramatic. Yet they gradually shifted the balance. For a while, it appeared that the Viking advance into southern England might continue without end. It did not. After years of conflict, Alfred achieved an important victory over the forces led by Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878. The outcome was significant not simply because one army defeated another. It created the possibility of negotiation. Guthrum accepted baptism as part of the peace agreement, and large areas of eastern and northern England became known as the Danelaw, regions where Scandinavian customs and legal traditions continued alongside those of the Anglo-Saxons. The result was not the complete triumph of one culture over another. Instead, England became a place where different traditions interacted every day. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Toft still reflect Norse settlement centuries later. Hundreds of words entered the English language through Old Norse influence. Familiar words such as sky, window, husband, knife, egg, law, and even the simple pronoun they carry echoes of these encounters. Sometimes the greatest victories in history are measured not in conquered territory but in ordinary words spoken around family tables long after battles have ended. Meanwhile, another remarkable story was unfolding far to the east. While many Vikings sailed toward Britain and France, Swedish Norse merchants and adventurers traveled along vast river systems stretching through modern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. These rivers became highways connecting the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and even the distant markets of Constantinople. The journey demanded extraordinary endurance. Ships often had to be dragged overland between river systems. Dense forests surrounded travelers for days at a time. Spring floods transformed familiar routes. Winter ice closed others completely. Yet the rewards proved irresistible. These eastern travelers became known in many sources as the Russ. Exactly how their communities developed remains the subject of scholarly debate, but there is broad agreement that Scandinavian influence played an important role in the emergence of early political centers around places such as Novgorod and Kiev. Merchants carried furs, wax, honey, amber, and enslaved people southward. They returned with silver coins, luxurious fabrics, wine, spices, jewelry, and ideas gathered from some of the wealthiest cities in the medieval world. Among all those distant destinations, none inspired greater wonder than Constantinople. To a traveler arriving from Scandinavia, the Byzantine capital must have seemed almost unimaginable. Massive stone walls stretched across the landscape. Church domes shimmered beneath sunlight. Bustling markets overflowed with goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Crowds filled broad streets where dozens of languages echoed between marble buildings. Some Norse warriors entered the service of the Byzantine emperors themselves, becoming members of the famous Varangian Guard. Chosen largely for their reputation as loyal and formidable fighters, these men protected emperors, guarded palace gates, and stood at the center of one of the richest empires on earth. Imagine the contrast. A young man raised beside a quiet Norwegian fjord now walking through the glittering halls of Constantinople, carrying an axe beneath mosaics of gold and brilliant blue. The world had become astonishingly connected. But perhaps no journeys better capture the restless spirit of the Viking Age than those that carried explorers westward into the open Atlantic. Unlike raids motivated by wealth, these voyages often sought something different. Land. The sea beyond Norway was filled with islands separated by enormous distances. First came the Shetlands. Then the Orkneys. Then the Faroe Islands. Eventually, Norse sailors reached Iceland during the late 9th century. At first glance, Iceland appeared both beautiful and unforgiving. Volcanoes rose above black lava fields. Glaciers covered distant mountains. Steam drifted from geothermal springs. Winters remained severe, yet the island also offered something increasingly scarce in Norway. Space. Families established farms along sheltered valleys. Communities formed. In the year 930, settlers created the Althing, one of the world's oldest surviving parliamentary institutions, where disputes were settled and laws were recited aloud beneath the open sky. It was a reminder that wherever the Norse traveled, they carried not only ships and weapons but also systems of law, memory, and community. And still they continued west. According to the Icelandic sagas, a man named Eric the Red, exiled after violent disputes, sailed farther into unknown waters and reached a vast icy land that he famously named Greenland. Whether he chose that name partly to attract settlers remains uncertain, but the strategy appears to have worked. Small Norse colonies soon appeared along Greenland's southwestern coast. Life there demanded remarkable resilience. The growing season was painfully short. Livestock required constant care. Supplies depended heavily on ships capable of crossing dangerous seas. Yet families endured. Churches were built. children were born. Communities survived for centuries on the edge of the known world. Few people could have imagined that the horizon still held one more extraordinary surprise. What happened next would carry the Norse farther west than any Europeans had knowingly traveled before, opening a chapter of exploration that would remain almost forgotten for centuries and reminding us once again that the Viking Age was never only the story of warriors. It was also the story of explorers willing to follow the sea beyond every familiar map, toward lands that existed first as rumors, then as hope, and finally as history itself. There is something quietly humbling about imagining a wooden ship sailing into waters that no one aboard had ever seen before. No detailed charts rested in the captain's hands. No compass pointed steadily toward the horizon. The crew relied on memory, experience, changing winds, the flight of birds, the movement of whales, the color of the sea, and perhaps a little faith that the world was larger than anyone had yet proven. That faith carried them farther west than almost anyone in medieval Europe believed possible. According to the Icelandic sagas, one voyage began almost by accident. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course while attempting to reach Greenland. Instead of finding the familiar settlement, he caught sight of unknown shores covered with forests. He did not land, choosing instead to continue toward Greenland, but his story remained. Years later, another explorer listened carefully. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, decided to search for the mysterious lands Bjarni had described. Around the beginning of the 11th century, his expedition sailed west across the cold Atlantic. According to the sagas, the explorers encountered several different landscapes, eventually reaching a place they called Vinland. Historians have debated the exact details of these voyages for generations. The sagas were written centuries after the events they describe, blending memory with storytelling. Yet one remarkable discovery changed the discussion forever. In the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lons Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in present-day Canada. Turf houses, ironworking evidence, and unmistakably Scandinavian artifacts revealed that Norse explorers had indeed reached North America around 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus. The settlement appears to have been relatively short-lived. Distance made communication difficult. Supplying such a remote outpost demanded extraordinary effort. Encounters with the indigenous peoples of North America, whom the sagas called the Skraelings, were complex and sometimes hostile. The medieval Norse accounts reflect only one perspective, and much about these interactions remains uncertain. What seems clear is that maintaining a permanent colony so far from Scandinavia proved far more difficult than the explorers had hoped. Yet the achievement itself remains astonishing. Without modern navigation, without accurate maps, and without knowledge of the continents waiting beyond the Atlantic, Norse sailors crossed one of the world's greatest oceans. It reminds us that curiosity has always pushed human beings beyond familiar horizons. But while some Vikings looked toward distant frontiers, events closer to home were beginning to reshape their own world. The Viking Age reached its height during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Scandinavian rulers gradually became more powerful. Instead of numerous independent chieftains competing for influence, larger kingdoms slowly emerged. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began developing stronger royal authority. The very success that Viking expansion had created was changing Scandinavian society itself. Trade generated wealth. Wealth strengthened kings. Kings demanded greater loyalty. Local independence slowly gave way to centralized rule. History often moves through quiet transformations like these. The changes seem gradual while they are happening. Only later do they appear revolutionary. Religion also became a powerful force in this transformation. For centuries, the Norse had worshipped gods whose stories reflected the harsh beauty of their homeland. Odin, the wise wanderer searching endlessly for knowledge. Thor, protector of both gods and ordinary people, whose mighty hammer defended order against chaos. Freya, associated with love, beauty, and war. Loki, clever, unpredictable, and forever blurring the line between help and disaster. Their myths explained storms, changing seasons, courage, sacrifice, and the uncertainty of life itself. These stories were shared not through sacred books but through memory, poetry, and oral tradition. Around winter fires, skalds recited tales that connected each new generation to those who had come before. Yet Christianity continued spreading northward. At first, many Norse traders encountered Christian beliefs abroad. Some accepted baptism for political or commercial reasons. Others remained devoted to traditional beliefs while peacefully interacting with Christian communities. Eventually, however, Scandinavian rulers recognized that adopting Christianity could strengthen diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms and reinforce royal authority. The conversion was neither immediate nor simple. Old beliefs remained deeply rooted. Some communities resisted. Others blended traditions for generations. Ancient festivals acquired Christian meanings while preserving familiar customs. Churches rose where sacred groves had once stood. Stone crosses appeared beside landscapes that had long echoed with stories of Odin and Thor. Rather than one dramatic moment, conversion unfolded across decades. It was a deeply human process. People carried memories of old beliefs even as their children embraced new ones. The Viking world was changing from within. And beyond Scandinavia, the age of great Viking kingdoms was approaching its final chapters. One remarkable ruler briefly united much of the North Sea world. Knut, known today as Knut the Great, inherited and conquered territory stretching across England, Denmark, and Norway during the early 11th century. He is sometimes remembered through a famous story in which he supposedly ordered the tide to stop. Later retellings often misunderstand the lesson. According to the traditional account, Knut placed his throne beside the sea and commanded the waves not to approach. The tide ignored him completely. Rather than demonstrating arrogance, many historians believe the story was intended to show humility, that even the most powerful king could not command nature itself. Whether the event happened exactly as described is impossible to know. But the lesson survived. Power has limits. Even empires cannot negotiate with the sea. After Knut's death, his vast realm gradually fragmented. Old rivalries returned. Political unity proved difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, the kingdoms of Europe had learned from generations of Viking attacks. Coastal defenses improved. Fortifications multiplied. Kings developed stronger administrations capable of raising larger armies more quickly. The conditions that had once favored lightning-fast Viking raids no longer existed. The world had adapted. One event often symbolizes the closing years of the Viking Age. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, launched an ambitious invasion of England. Hardrada was no ordinary ruler. He had fought across Europe, served in the Varangian Guard at Constantinople, and earned a reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his generation. His campaign reflected both confidence and extraordinary ambition. At first, success seemed possible. His forces won an important victory at the Battle of Fulford. But only days later, everything changed. King Harold Godwinson marched his English army north with remarkable speed. At Stamford Bridge, the two armies met. The battle was fierce. Harald Hardrada was killed. The Norwegian invasion collapsed. Historians often point to Stamford Bridge as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. There is a quiet irony here. Only weeks after defeating Hardrada, Harold Godwinson himself faced another invasion, this time from William, Duke of Normandy. William's ancestors had themselves descended from Vikings who had settled in northern France generations earlier. History had come full circle. The descendants of Norse settlers would conquer England through a kingdom that had long ceased to think of itself as Viking. The age ended. Its influence did not. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. Today, the Viking world survives in countless ways that most people rarely notice. Many towns across Britain, Ireland, and France still preserve Norse place names. Modern English carries hundreds of words inherited from Old Norse. Archaeologists continue uncovering longhouses, workshops, burial sites, and ships that reveal lives far richer and more complex than older stereotypes suggested. The famous Viking longships themselves remain masterpieces of engineering. Museums display them not merely as weapons of war but as symbols of craftsmanship, exploration, and remarkable maritime knowledge. Modern DNA studies also remind us that Viking history was never simply a tale of isolated Scandinavian warriors. Centuries of migration, marriage, trade, and settlement connected people across Europe and beyond in ways medieval chroniclers could scarcely have imagined. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding about the Vikings is believing they were only raiders. Yes, they fought. Yes, they conquered. Yes, they inspired fear. But they were also farmers nurturing small fields through unforgiving winters. They were merchants linking continents through expanding trade routes. They were poets preserving memory in beautiful verse. They were explorers reaching Iceland, Greenland, and North America. They were lawmakers gathering beneath open skies to settle disputes. They were craftsmen whose artistry still astonishes historians. Like every society, they contained contradictions. History has a habit of flattening people into simple symbols. The real Norse world refuses to remain that simple. Its people could be courageous and ruthless, generous and ambitious, curious and fearful, creative and destructive. In other words, unmistakably human. Perhaps that is why their story continues to fascinate us after more than 1,000 years. Not because they were mythical giants sailing beneath dragon-headed prows, but because they stood where all people eventually stand, between the familiar and the unknown. They looked toward distant horizons and wondered what waited there. Sometimes they found prosperity. Sometimes tragedy. Often both. As the centuries passed, their kingdoms changed, their beliefs evolved, and their famous longships gradually disappeared from Europe's seas. Grass grew over abandoned settlements in Greenland. Timber rotted beneath old harbors. The songs of skalds faded into silence. Yet memory remained. It survived in sagas copied by careful hands. In weathered runestones standing quietly beside country roads. In buried silver discovered beneath forgotten fields. In words we still speak without realizing where they came from. And in the enduring human desire to explore beyond the next horizon. If you visit the fjords of Norway today, especially in the calm hours of early morning, you may notice how still the water can become. Mountains rise almost silently from the sea, their reflections barely disturbed by the gentle movement of the tide. It is not difficult to imagine a slender wooden ship emerging from the mist, its sail catching the first light of dawn, carrying people who had no certainty about what awaited them beyond the horizon. They could not know that historians would one day write books about them. They could not know that museums across the world would carefully preserve the ships they built. They could not know that children, centuries later, would still hear stories of Odin, Thor, Leif Erikson, Alfred, Knut, and Harald Hardrada. They simply lived their lives, making decisions one voyage at a time. Some choices changed only a single family. Others reshaped continents. That is often how history works. Its greatest transformations rarely announce themselves. They begin quietly, with ordinary people stepping into uncertainty. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of the Viking Age. Not that fearless warriors conquered distant shores, but that human curiosity, resilience, and ambition can carry people farther than they ever imagined possible. As our journey through the medieval North comes gently to an end, the wind has settled, the sea has grown calm once more, and the dragon-headed ships have slipped back into history. If you are still awake, thank you for letting this story keep you company for a little while. I hope these quiet footsteps through the past have brought both wonder and peace. Somewhere beyond tonight's horizon, another forgotten road through history is waiting patiently for us. But for now, let the room remain still. Let the echoes of the waves fade into silence. Let the longships drift beyond the mist, and let the night carry you gently toward rest. The story of the Vikings does not truly end when the last great fleet returns home or when the final famous battle fades into memory. History rarely closes its chapters so neatly. Instead, it leaves behind quiet echoes, small traces scattered across landscapes, languages, traditions, and even the ways people imagine the past. If we listen carefully, those echoes can still be heard today. Centuries after the Viking Age had passed, farmers across Scandinavia occasionally uncovered strange objects while plowing their fields. A silver bracelet would emerge from dark soil. A finely crafted brooch, hidden for generations, would catch the sunlight once more. Sometimes an entire hoard of coins appeared beneath a stone or inside the remains of an old wooden chest. No one could say with certainty who had buried them. Perhaps a merchant had hidden his savings before setting sail, intending to return. Perhaps a family buried their wealth during a time of war. Perhaps someone simply never survived the journey home. Each discovery reminds us that behind every artifact was a person whose hopes and fears were every bit as real as our own. Archaeologists often speak of these discoveries with great excitement, not because of the value of the silver itself, but because each object tells a story. A single coin minted in Baghdad and buried in Sweden reveals an astonishing truth. The Viking world was connected to places thousands of miles away. Through rivers, seas, caravans, and countless exchanges, Scandinavian traders became part of one of the largest trading networks of the medieval world. Imagine holding that coin in your hand. It may have passed through the fingers of an Arab merchant in a bustling market. It may have crossed deserts on the back of a camel. It may have traveled aboard ships through the Black Sea before reaching the Baltic. Eventually, it found its way into the pocket of a Norse trader standing beside a quiet northern fjord. The object itself remained silent. Its journey speaks volumes. The same is true of the famous Viking ships that have survived beneath the earth. For centuries, many of these vessels rested in burial mounds where kings, queens, and powerful nobles were laid to rest. Covered by layers of soil and grass, they disappeared from view until modern excavations carefully uncovered them once again. One of the most extraordinary discoveries came in Norway in the early 20th century. The Oseberg ship had rested beneath a burial mound for more than 1,000 years. When archaeologists slowly removed the surrounding earth, they revealed not simply a ship, but an entire world. Beautiful wood carvings curled along the vessel's sides with astonishing elegance. Sleds, wagons, carved animal heads, textiles, household goods, and countless personal belongings surrounded the burial chamber. Inside lay the remains of two women. Who they were remains uncertain. Some scholars believe one may have been a queen. Others suggest a powerful priestess. The evidence does not provide complete answers. Yet perhaps that mystery is fitting. History sometimes preserves remarkable objects while allowing individual names to disappear. The women themselves remain partly hidden. Their world survives. And this is where the story becomes even more human. Popular culture has often portrayed Viking society as one dominated entirely by warriors. Battle certainly occupied an important place within Norse culture, but archaeology paints a far richer picture. Excavations reveal skilled blacksmiths producing delicate jewelry alongside powerful weapons. Weavers created beautiful fabrics using techniques requiring remarkable patience. Woodworkers crafted furniture decorated with intricate animal designs unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Farmers carefully managed livestock through harsh winters. Children played with carved toys. Musicians performed using simple instruments whose melodies have long since faded into silence. Daily life filled far more hours than warfare ever did. Most people who lived during the Viking Age probably spent far more time repairing fences, feeding animals, preparing meals, and caring for children than carrying swords into battle. That simple truth is easy to forget. History often remembers extraordinary moments while overlooking ordinary lives. Yet ordinary lives built extraordinary civilizations. Modern technology has also transformed our understanding of the Viking world. DNA analysis reveals patterns of migration that written sources alone could never fully explain. Ancient skeletons provide clues about diet, disease, travel, and family relationships. Scientific studies of tree rings help date the construction of ships and buildings with remarkable precision. Even tiny fragments of pollen preserved beneath ancient floors reveal what people grew, ate, and carried into their homes. Each new discovery adds another brushstroke to an ever-growing portrait. Sometimes these discoveries challenge long-held assumptions. For many years, people imagined Viking expeditions consisting almost entirely of men. More recent archaeological evidence suggests a more complicated reality. Women traveled during periods of settlement. Families established new communities abroad. Some graves containing weapons, once automatically assumed to belong to male warriors, have upon closer scientific examination revealed female remains. Historians continue debating exactly what these discoveries mean, but they remind us of an important principle. The past is never completely finished. Each generation asks new questions. Each discovery encourages fresh interpretations. History is not a fixed monument. It is an ongoing conversation. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in the Icelandic sagas. Written centuries after many of the events they describe, these remarkable stories preserve memories of exploration, family feuds, voyages, love, revenge, law, humor, tragedy, and survival. They are neither simple fiction nor perfect history. Instead, they exist somewhere in between. Like old family stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, they preserve emotional truths even when individual details become difficult to verify. When we read about Leif Erikson sailing toward Vinland or Eric the Red establishing Greenland, we hear voices reaching across nearly 1,000 years. Those voices are imperfect. Sometimes contradictory. Occasionally exaggerated. Yet profoundly human. The Vikings themselves probably never imagined that people living in the 21st century would still discuss their journeys. They could not foresee museums filled with visitors quietly studying the ships they built. They could not imagine satellites mapping the coastlines they once explored by instinct alone. Nor could they know that their stories would inspire novels, films, television series, historical research, and quiet bedtime documentaries listened to around the world. Their age ended. Their fascination did not. Perhaps that is because the Viking story touches something deeply familiar within all of us. The desire to explore. The hope of finding opportunity beyond familiar horizons. The courage to leave home despite uncertainty. The fear of never returning. The challenge of balancing ambition with responsibility. These experiences belong not only to medieval Scandinavia. They belong to humanity itself. As evening settles once again over the northern fjords, the water reflects the fading light just as it did 1,000 years ago. The mountains remain patient. The forests still whisper when the wind passes through them. Waves continue to meet rocky shores with the same quiet rhythm that Viking children once heard as they drifted to sleep inside warm wooden longhouses. Empires have risen and fallen. Kingdoms have changed their borders. Religions have spread. Languages have evolved. Yet the sea remains. Perhaps that is the most fitting symbol of the Viking Age. The sea was never truly their enemy. Nor was it entirely their friend. It was their path. It connected distant worlds, carried dreams and dangers alike, and reminded every sailor that no matter how skilled they became, nature always deserved respect. And so, as our long journey through the Viking Age finally reaches its quiet harbor, we leave behind more than tales of raids and battles. We leave with a deeper understanding of a people whose lives were shaped by courage, hardship, craftsmanship, faith, curiosity, and an endless horizon that always seemed to invite one more voyage. If this story has accompanied you into the quiet hours of the night, then perhaps it has done what history does best. Not simply to teach us what happened, but to remind us that every age, no matter how distant, was once the present for someone living through it. Somewhere, more than 1,000 years ago, a child watched a longship disappear into the morning mist, wondering when it would return. Somewhere else, an old sailor sat beside a fire, telling stories that would outlive him by centuries. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the North Sea continued its timeless rhythm, carrying ships toward futures no one could yet imagine. For now, let those waves grow quieter. Let the cold northern wind fade into the distance. Let the stars above the fjords shine gently over a world that has long since changed, yet still remembers. Sleep well, and until our next journey into the past, may history keep you peaceful company through the night. Long after the Viking Age had passed into memory, people continued to tell stories about the men and women of the North. Around crackling hearths in Iceland, beneath the timber roofs of Norwegian farmhouses, and inside monasteries where monks carefully copied fading manuscripts, the past slowly transformed into legend. With every generation, the stories grew a little larger. A brave captain became fearless. A difficult voyage became impossible. A clever escape became the work of fate itself. This is something history often does. Memory smooths away uncertainty. It turns complicated people into symbols, and ordinary moments into unforgettable legends. Yet if we look carefully beneath those layers of storytelling, we discover something far more interesting than myth alone. We discover real people. A fisherman who knew every current of his local fjord. A blacksmith whose hands shaped both plowshares and swords. A mother who spent long winters spinning wool while waiting for family members to return from distant voyages. A child learning the names of stars because those stars might one day guide a ship safely home. These quiet lives rarely appear in medieval chronicles. No king recorded them. No famous poet celebrated them. Yet together they formed the foundation of the Viking world. Without farmers, there could be no expeditions. Without shipbuilders, there could be no exploration. Without traders, there could be no growing towns. Without families willing to endure long separations, there could be no Viking Age at all. This perspective changes the story. Instead of seeing history as the work of a few extraordinary leaders, we begin to recognize the countless ordinary people whose daily choices slowly reshaped the medieval world. Even today, the influence of the Norse can be found in unexpected places. Walk through the countryside of northern England, and many village names still preserve Old Norse endings that have survived for over 1,000 years. Visit museums in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Britain, Ireland, or Iceland, and you will find combs carved from antler, delicate rings of silver, children's toys fashioned from wood, and everyday cooking pots blackened by ancient fires. These humble objects often tell us more than royal crowns ever could. They remind us that history was lived one ordinary day at a time. The Vikings also left behind a remarkable literary inheritance. The Icelandic sagas remain among the greatest achievements of medieval storytelling. They speak of courage and failure, loyalty and betrayal, humor and sorrow. Their characters are rarely perfect. Heroes make mistakes. Villains sometimes show kindness. Families argue over land, inheritance, and honor in ways that still feel surprisingly familiar. That humanity is one reason the sagas continue to be read today. They remind us that although technology changes, the human heart changes far more slowly. People still dream. They still fear. They still hope for a better future than the one they inherited. Modern historians continue to learn new things every year. Underwater archaeology has uncovered shipwrecks preserved beneath cold northern seas. Satellite imagery reveals forgotten settlements hidden beneath forests and fields. Tiny fragments of ancient pollen help reconstruct landscapes that vanished centuries ago. Even the smallest discovery, a broken bead, a worn leather shoe, or the remains of an old fishing net, can reshape our understanding of how Viking communities truly lived. History is never completely finished. It is a conversation between the past and the present, growing richer with every new discovery. Perhaps that is why the Viking Age continues to fascinate people across the world. It contains adventure without losing sight of hardship. It celebrates exploration while acknowledging its costs. It remembers courage without pretending that courage erased fear. Most of all, it reminds us that history is rarely as simple as the legends we inherit. The Vikings were not only raiders. They were not only explorers. They were not only traders. They were all of these things, sometimes within the same lifetime. A man might spend one season farming, another trading, and another sailing with a war band. Life demanded flexibility. Survival required adaptation. The sea rewarded those who learned quickly. It punished those who became careless. As the centuries passed, Scandinavia became firmly woven into Christian Europe. Great stone cathedrals replaced many wooden temples. Royal governments became stronger. Written laws replaced traditions remembered only by word of mouth. The dragon-headed longships that had once inspired fear slowly disappeared from the waves, replaced by new designs suited to a changing world. But they were never truly forgotten. Artists continued carving scenes from the old myths. Poets remembered Odin's endless search for wisdom. Children smiled at stories of Thor and his mighty hammer. Families repeated the names of ancestors whose graves overlooked the same fjords their descendants still called home. In this way, memory survived alongside history. One preserved facts. The other preserved identity. If you could stand tonight beside a quiet Scandinavian shoreline, you might hear little more than gentle waves touching smooth stones. The air would carry the scent of salt and pine. Seabirds would drift above dark water, just as they did 1,000 years ago. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies every place the Vikings once sailed: Britain, Ireland, France, Iceland, Greenland, the rivers of Eastern Europe, the distant walls of Constantinople, and even the shores of North America. The ships are gone. The wake they left upon history remains. And perhaps that is the most peaceful way to remember them. Not as unstoppable conquerors. Not as characters from fantasy. But as people who looked across an uncertain sea and chose to keep going. Some returned with stories. Some returned with wealth. Some never returned at all. Yet each voyage added another thread to the long fabric of human history. Our own world, connected by oceans, trade, travel, and shared ideas, still carries echoes of those distant journeys. So as our final candle burns lower and the northern stars shine quietly overhead, let the Viking Age drift gently back into the mist from which it first emerged. Let the sound of oars fade into the rhythm of the waves. Let the old sagas rest once more beneath the endless sky of the north. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through medieval history together. If sleep has not yet found you, perhaps it is close now, arriving as softly as dawn over a still Norwegian fjord. Until our next walk through the past, may the night remain calm, your thoughts untroubled, and your dreams filled with distant shores where history still whispers with every passing tide.